one of the key policy objectives of the critical mineral strategy is really to develop the downstream processing.
In order to be able to drive EVs and to have your wind turbines and solar PVs panels up and running, you need to start investing in mining now, because otherwise you will have bottlenecks down the road.
We have to change our culture, we have to change our mindset, we have to be aware of what we're consuming. And we've got to get away from, absolutely have to get away from this attitude that everything is disposable.
It's just increasing people's level of general knowledge, I think, is going to be the biggest thing. Who does that? It's partly industry, it's partly government, it's partly forums like this as well.
I would like to welcome everyone today to the Assay Live webinar on supply constraints and critical minerals projects for supply chains. So today we have Jan Fuchter, Director, Project and Structured Finance at Export Finance Australia. We have Adrian Griffin, Managing Director at Lithium Australia. Dan Porter, Portfolio Manager for the Resources Fund at Pure Asset Management. And Jeff Amrish-Riteau, Energy and Raw Materials Advisor. So thanks everyone for joining us at this webinar today. So this webinar was really put together on the back of an announcement made by the Australian government about the establishment of a $2 billion loan facility for domestic critical minerals projects. And so minerals such as lithium and rare earths are really going to be a growing strategic focus for governments around the world due to their position in the future energy economy. Demand is expected to grow significantly. And we're seeing lately a lot of supply might not be exactly where we need it to be. So I thought we could kick off this webinar today looking at if we could get a little bit of background regarding this, the Australian government's new loan facility, and perhaps we can start to look at the implications that we see for Australia's mining industry. So I thought, Jan, because you're with Export Finance Australia, if you could help to provide a little bit of background into this loan facility and sort of what you see happening here.
Sure, thanks, Amy. The recently announced critical minerals facility is really a further step in the government's focus on critical minerals. The government announced a critical minerals strategy in 2019, I think the early 2019. Later in the year, there was a ministerial announcement which identified Export Finance Australia and the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility as government agencies that could be involved in the financing of critical minerals projects. So with the announcement of the facility, this is really a further emphasis on government side to demonstrate their commitments to the development of critical minerals projects. What the facility really allows is an allocation of $2 billion of funding, which Export Finance Australia can then provide through the National Interest Account, which is one of the accounts that we are able to provide funding for projects and transactions which are deemed to be in the national interest. So critical mineral projects are really part of the national interest and in achieving certain policy objectives in terms of the broader strategy.
Okay, and what is kind of what are people saying about this so far within Australia?
I guess people are getting.
Sorry,
I guess people are getting quite excited about it, and it's good to see a move in the right direction. But if you take a cynical point of view, something I would never do, of course, but if you take a cynical point of view and look at what they've done from a budgetary constraint viewpoint, they've really moved funds from one bucket into another, and the bucket they moved it from, which effectively is a broad brushed bucket of money for clean energy, may well have got to critical minerals in any case. It's hard to say that you can develop clean energy technologies without critical minerals. In fact, you can't. So what it's doing is creating a bit of focus for an election campaign.
So we've seen, looking at kind of the issue of supply chains, we've seen firsthand over the past few years what can happen when there is a breakdown in the global supply chains. Sort of what started out during the pandemic and seems to be continuing even now. What sort of impact do these sorts of disruptions have on the mining and metals industry? And do we see any of these supply chain issues being rectified at this point yet? Maybe I'll send this over to Dan to kick off.
Yeah, no, thanks, Amy. Appreciate that. That's it's an excellent question, and I think what we've really seen over the past 12 months is a real rising concern from policy makers, particularly just regarding our ability to source a lot of these critical minerals. You know, oftentimes, or particularly in the last 30 years, we've really outsourced a lot of our manufacturing capability into Asia, and that's where a lot of the critical minerals actually, originate from these days, which makes a lot of sense. If you've got manufacturing right at your doorstep, you integrate with your supply chain that's right there. Today, as we sit in Australia, we're seeing a number of supply chains breaking down. Not the least of which, seeing coming into through the ports in Australia coming into Christmas. It's really created a huge issue across a whole number of industries. That's really put the policymakers on alert that we need to refocus back to Australia or domestic supply chains, if you like, whether depending on where your government sits. And I think also a lot of governments have looked at where potentially where defence relationships sit. Oftentimes, critical minerals sit pretty well entrenched in defence industries, and looking to move that location of critical minerals to a supply chain that they can rely on. So an ally or something like that is something that we're seeing. Very, very strong interest out of those types of countries from an Australian perspective. But what it's meant from a financing perspective is that there's a real momentum now in the sector, and it's not just for the bigger, more well-known minerals, like your lithiums and things like that, cobalts, but certainly moving down the scale into things like tungsten, for example. Where Australia has a fairly large supply of tungsten, but we don't produce much of it. But without tungsten, a huge number of industries in Australia would fall apart literally tomorrow. Not the least of which is mining, because obviously tungsten is a very strong product that adds a lot into ground engaging tools and things like that. But we're seeing a lot of demand now from smaller companies for financing, and particularly that sort of pre-construction or pre-development type financing. The project financiers are still a little hesitant, I think, to fund a lot of these projects because it's very difficult to get a read on supply and demand in these end markets. There's no traded market like an LME type scenario where you get a good insight on price. Oftentimes, 80 or 90% of a particular critical mineral can come out of one country, and we see that a lot of times with China as well. So it's very difficult to get a good view as a project financier on offtake and what the value of that commodity might be over a 10 or a 20-year period. So that makes it very, very difficult. For a fund like ours, we're seeing a lot of inbound interest from both pre-development capital and going into that project financing space as well, which is, from a pure resources aspect, it's not something that we particularly do, but for a recent investment that we made, we did participate in a project finance facility, which 12 months ago when we were setting up the fund, we never would have envisaged. But the fact of the matter is now there's a huge pool of capital sitting there. And, thankfully for Yarn and the government side, there is a growing momentum, I think, from a number of agencies, Export Credit Finance, Investment New South Wales, Invest Queensland, those types of agencies as well, to really underpin a lot of that early stage investment in the sector. But it will take, I think, and it needs that now, because we need some more clarity on where we're getting the product from over the next 5 or 10 years. Once that's in there, the investment markets will come back in. But for the moment, it's very, very difficult to obtain financing for a lot of these projects. And that's certainly appearing in some of the discounts to equity that we're seeing in terms of equity raises and the interest rates that we're seeing being charged through the sector as well. But definitely a very, very hot space at the moment, and I think will grow in momentum over the next 2 or 3 years.
And, Amy, can I just add something to what Dan was explaining there? I think I definitely agree with Dan's feedback there. To make it a little bit more concrete and specific, I think the industry, and especially the junior companies that are trying to build a project and go into construction, are actually in a sort of a catch-22 situation right now, because if you look at the negative impact of supply chains, what do these companies have to deal with? They have to deal with increasing prices of raw materials. They have to deal with increasing prices of construction material. So that influences your project economics. And a couple of companies that I've spoken to as potential investor into their new projects, for instance, lithium refining companies that want to expand their facilities, actually had to deal with higher capex, so capital expenditures, because of this supply chain constraint. So the point is that I'm trying to clarify a little bit more is that you're really starting to notice, especially at the level of junior companies, has an impact. And the longer term impact will be that these companies will not be able to reach commercial operation date at the time that they initially hoped for, which will again impact the supply of raw materials into the system. And therefore, at the end, will negatively impact the speed at which the transition to clean energy takes place. So that's the strange situation that we are in. In addition, we see that because there is also a supply constraint on the energy side, we also see that raw material prices increase, because China at the moment is clearly saying to its producers of battery materials, guys, let's curtail production for the time being, because it's hard to get gas. So I think the industry is in a perfect storm. On the one hand, demand downstream is increasing, and the world is aligned, luckily, that we need to transition to clean energy. But at the same time, because of these supply chain constraints, small companies especially are looking at higher capital expenditures, which makes it harder for them to get that project financed.
Yeah, good comments, Jeff. Could I make a general comment about the lithium industry in particular and that supply chain? Because at the moment, almost in entirety, it goes through China and ends up in batteries. And if you have a look at the way that supply chain works, it's got an unreasonably high carbon footprint because of all the transportation involved in that supply chain. And that revolves around moving materials as spodumene concentrates from Western Australia to China for downstream processing. Now, those materials that you move are only about 6% at best lithium. So 94% of the stuff that you're creating a carbon footprint around is waste. So quite clearly that supply chain really needs to change. We are seeing some changes in that supply chain, in that we're seeing refining capacity being built in Western Australia. But if you take the first of those, not by name, but if you take the first of those that was mooted in Western Australia, it started construction 5 years ago, and today it's still not producing lithium chemicals. So there's a long lead time on these things, but for the sake of the environment, we need to reduce the length of those supply chains. So we should be processing low-grade materials and concentrates close to their source. Now, what we saw in the last lithium shortage 2 or 3 years ago was companies exporting direct shipping ore at 1.2% to China. Think of the carbon footprint you've got there. So carbon footprint is certainly something we need to look at. The other thing we need to look at, of course, is strategic supply, and also keeping that refining capacity close to source aids in the sorts of things that have been mentioned in the past, security of supply, particularly with respect to things like defence applications. This goes a lot further, of course, than just lithium. The same applies to most of the battery materials, and the rare earths even more so, where China absolutely dominates, you might say, monopolises the downstream processing. So I think we need to have a good look at these supply chains for a number of reasons.
It's a really good point, Adrian, and I'd just add a little bit further to that from an Australian perspective as well, is that the problem that Australia always faces is the tyranny of distance. We're a long way from where products are made, and certainly, in the case of a lot of the processing for some of these critical minerals, we're a long way from where the processing takes place as well. Which means that from an Australian perspective, a lot of investors, and us particularly, are really focused on grade. They always say in mining, grade is king. And, to Adrian's point as well, shipping, 1% lithium to China does not make much sense. So we're fortunate in Australia that a lot of the critical mineral projects are actually quite high grades. They're just not developed yet. So there's a huge pipeline of projects that will come through, I think, in the next 5 or 10 years. And Australia can be really at the forefront, but I think we need domestic processing here yesterday. That's really going to be the thing that drives the industry. And we've seen, I saw this just this morning, there was an announcement about vanadium processing, a multi-user vanadium processing in North Queensland and Townsville. I think that's the sort of steps by government that we need to see. They've really got to take the lead. They've got to drive that. But it's a market impediment at the moment. The market is probably not going to jump in to do those facilities because the returns, aren't amazing from a financial perspective. But if the government wants, to move down the path that we're all moving down, they really need to step in here. And, the critical minerals strategy, I think, is really the first part of that. There probably needs to be really a lot more engagement with industry and the mining industry particularly. And I think what we're seeing really at the moment in the whole push to net zero is this whole bucket that mining is bad. And it's not. We're going to need a lot more mining, and we're going to have to work with the mining industry and resources industry a lot more than we have done in the past 50 years, over the next 50.
And
some good comments there. I think if we do look at some of those supply chains, we can see the fundamental problems. And if we want to capture more value in Australia, and really we should be doing that, because it's not just a supply chain issue, it's a labour issue, and it's a national economy issue. And we're a country that controls the supply of raw materials, just about every one of them, into clean energy technologies, and we don't add much value to them. Now, the current $2 billion facility is certainly a step in the right direction, but eventually, if we want this to work, someone's got to pay for it, and the government should bite the bullet and do something a bit better than moving funds from one bucket to another and saying there's $2 billion available. They should start looking at something like a higher yield green bond or critical materials bond, and actually pay for the privilege of developing that industry here. And if they did that, there'd be plenty of funds that would invest in those bonds, and we could get money back into the industry and secure those supply chains. And not only that, secure the value in that supply chain, and the value in that supply chain will make the taxation revenue to offset the higher coupon on the bonds. It's not rocket science.
Bring back infrastructure bonds that we used to see 20 years ago, Adrian.
That's exactly the concept I'm talking about.
Yep.
So I wanted to bring the discussion a little bit back to the funding issue. So what types of projects are you seeing being funded right now, more generally? And where are the gaps that you're noticing? Maybe Adrian can kick us off here. You know, what is the financing environment that you find yourself in right now?
As a listed company on the ASX, I've got to say I've never seen more opportunity from a financing point of view. And if you look at the investment climate globally, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of money being poured into ESG investments, renewables, and anything that's a push to zero carbon. And that, I guess, is starting to align with future legislation. The European Union, of course, looking very strongly at emissions of all types and carbon and the way you move those things around across borders and importing into Europe and exporting out of Europe. So I think really the investment appetite is for clean energy, not surprising.
Yeah, Adrian, I think I agree. I would like to add one thing, though. I think if you look at the global investments in clean energy or the clean energy supply chain over 2020, and it will be slightly different in 2021, there is a 80 billion gap between what money or what amount of money was poured into downstream applications. So let's call it EVs, EV charging, and batteries, and investments in upstream. And I think I fully agree that there is a momentum at the moment, but I do think that the funds that are pouring in upstream, i.e. mining and processing of critical minerals, is lagging behind compared to the investments downstream. So I think more can be done in that respect. And part of it, I think also, having had multiple conversations with big investment companies and pension funds in Europe, it comes down to education and raising awareness and working on the image of mining. I think mining still has an image problem. I think we as an industry need to work on improving that image, because otherwise there will be bottlenecks to serve that downstream demand.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that as well. I'll just add a little that I think the financing is there for a lot of the critical minerals if they're bigger, well-known commodities, like your lithiums, I think, certain types of rare earths, things like that. But if you move sort of 2 or 3 names below that sort of top 5, the financing market is very, very difficult for any of those commodities, I think. Certainly from what we've seen is projects that you would expect to get project financing very, very quickly and easily. The market is just not there. So they're having to push out into, very, very different methods of finding financing. And a lot of these companies are finding it pretty hard. Adrian's probably sitting in a unique position that he's had his lithium processing running for 18 years and he's got a bit of a track record, and that's fine. But if you're just trying to start a new vanadium mine or a new tungsten mine or something like that, that is very difficult to finance at the minute. And I think what we've seen from some other government facilities that have been in place is the intention is there, but maybe the execution is always the issue. We've seen with, like a NAIF, for example, where it's been running for a very long time. It's had a lot of trouble actually deploying into investments. And, there's a whole myriad of reasons for that. It's not just NAIF. But there is sometimes a hesitance and a speed that doesn't come from government necessarily, which I think it probably needs to be addressed a little bit. But certainly in the interim, that sort of bridging finance or hybrid financing, is starting to step in and finding those opportunities. But it's still very, very tough out there. Yeah.
I'd like to bring Jan into the discussion on the financing as well.
Thanks, Amy. And Dan, just to pick up on some of your points, I think the points that you make are all very valid. I think since we started engaging with critical mineral proponents, since the strategy was announced some 2 years ago, I think it's fair to say that there haven't been all that many critical mineral projects that were ready for development. So that's a process that the proponents have been working on, and it's pleasing to see that a lot of progress has been made. And so as they work through their various stages of their feasibility study, I think that in the coming year, I think you will see that that projects will be ready for financing. I think one of the challenges that the critical minerals sector, if I can call it that, is confronted by is that most of the proponents tend to be of a junior nature, and that in itself can present a sort of more conventional type financier some challenges. If you look at to the extent that there are still banks active in project financing for mining projects, they tend to struggle with single asset companies, junior proponents. And I think once you layer on top of that potential processing risk or technical risk, because very often these kind of projects require unproven, or at least at a commercial scale, processing technology. Being junior companies, they are limited in terms of being able to provide completion support. Often the equity component that's required is often a multiple of their market cap. Although having said that, some of the valuations or market caps of critical mineral companies have really moved up quite considerably in recent times. And then, as a number of you have touched on in terms of the markets for critical mineral commodities, they tend to be opaque, or they're thinly traded, limited number of producers, limited number of buyers, difficult to identify any mechanisms for price discovery. So in terms of providing lenders some degree of comfort, the importance is trying to secure offtake commitments. And then when you look at the potential buyers for a lot of these commodities, they tend to be very large companies. And then you have a junior proponent wanting to negotiate with a very large buyer. And it becomes a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Does the proponent have to secure the finance before they can get an offtake commitment? Can they enter into an offtake commitment before they have the finance? So, I think there are a number of different challenges that these companies have to work through. And some of them are working through those, and hopefully that will put them in a good place in the coming 6 to 12 months.
So I just want to sorry to interrupt.
I just said I just said that's good to hear. Thanks, Jan. Yeah.
I'd like to open up the floor to questions from the audience as well at this point, and then we can continue on. I'll take these as they come. If you can just type any questions that you have into the Q&A box, we'll take them and address them as they come in. We started to briefly touch on the idea of processing facilities and the importance of having those as, domestic projects being funded. Does anyone want to touch on kind of what you see happening on that front? So maybe not necessarily on the mining side, but looking a little bit further downstream into processing domestically.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick that off, Amy. Look, I think one thing Australia has always been very, very good at is mining and beneficiation. I think what has been lacking in recent times is the further downstream processing. And as Adrian pointed out, with regards to lithium, either a concentrate or even just a direct shipping ore gets shipped to China for processing. So, and again, I'm not speaking this in terms of policy, but one of the key policy objectives of the critical mineral strategy is really to develop the downstream processing. So, when we look at projects that hope to produce a a critical mineral commodity, an important component of that is understanding the company's objectives in terms of developing that downstream processing, and the technology and that's used in that, and that in itself can be both interesting and challenging, but those are the kind of hurdles that we all collectively have to overcome.
I think if you look at, if I may just add to that, I'm not an Australian, but I follow Australian companies with great interest. And I think in that respect, specifically on the topic of processing, there are some encouraging developments. Pilbara Minerals, for instance, their collaboration with Calix, I think is a good example. So Calix is a company that actually can help build facilities to process raw materials into higher value materials. And there's a specific collaboration between the two companies to look at electric calcination to process these materials further, and then to send concentrate to China rather than just ores and raw material, which does not only save costs, but also is better for the environment. Now, I think this is a good example of two Aussie companies that work together, bundle their forces, and not only try to add more value in the country, but also do it in a greener way. And then if you dive a little bit deeper into that example, if you look at processing, there are two things that are required and that really are the bulk of the costs in processing. First of all is your raw materials, but second of all, your energy and your energy consumption. And I think Australia is in a unique position, maybe together with Canada, that it actually can control both, right? Australia has an abundance in raw materials, so it can achieve or retrieve that quite cheaply and easily. And then again, it also has access to plenty of sources for energy, and especially clean energy. So I think, especially in processing, Australia can at least on paper, play a very important role and actually can become a leader in making the processing cleaner and cheaper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add a little to that as well. I think the one thing that is probably going to hold Australia back from that in a way is skills shortages and the labour market as well. I think, if you look at courses, like geology, where 10 years ago they were in really high demand, today they're really not. And I think it comes back to this fixation that we have on the mining industry, and people aren't going into it out of school anymore. They're not studying it in the numbers that they were. There's some places where that definitely is not the case, but the desire to work in that industry is probably not there like it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So Australia's going to need a lot more skilled workers, whether that's coming through our own university systems or through a very, very targeted migration program, which Australia's done in a lot of industries before. But we are going to need a lot more people that have that skill set to be able to enact this, because I think from an Australian perspective, we started to unwind our manufacturing capability probably 30 years ago. And it's probably something that we really need to address, to Jeff and Jan's point. But the people is going to be, the biggest requirement, I think, to that moving ahead at a faster pace than what it already is.
Yeah, that was certainly one of the questions that came in from the audience in advance, is really how to address the labor shortages in the industry. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on the labor.
Salaries are always a good one. And look, really, I think, a lot of the demand for jobs and things like that are going into the tech space. And I think people can see that you can make a lot of money really quickly going into tech if you choose the right thing. We just need to make mining a similar approach, really. It's difficult because there is a skill set that you need to learn, right? And that's, it's not just take a stab at creating the next social media network or something like that. There is a lot of experience that you need to do these projects properly. But I think the industry is going to have to be prepared to pay a lot more for staff than they have been in the past.
Yeah. Amy, I saw a question from someone in the audience in the Q&A, which I think is an interesting one to discuss, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
So basically the question is, or it was more of a remark actually, the major technical challenge for critical minerals is that it concerns long lead items for over 10 years. From exploration to commercial production, and investors need to be prepared for such long lead time. I think that's a really valid point, and it's one of the challenges coming back to education. Why people need to understand that in order to be able to drive EVs and to have your wind turbines and solar PVs panels up and running, you need to start investing in mining now, because otherwise you will have bottlenecks down the road. But if you link that to that challenge to funding, how do you explain that to potential financiers that you're buying into a project that basically can take up to 10 years before it makes any money? And what I've actually been quite surprised about up to now is the lack of involvement of venture capitalists in mining. And to explain why I'm surprised, if you look at the profile of a junior mining company, it's basically not very different from a startup. They're burning cash like hell. There is no certainty whether it will work, but there is a line of sight at one point that it will start to produce, and hopefully it will be scalable. If that company, that junior company, also has a processing activity on top of that, then it also has a tech element that could be scalable. So, I see some similarities. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but I see some similarities between investments in early exploration and production companies next to your typical Silicon Valley startup, tech startup that is basically burning cash for the first 7 to 10 years as well. And what I would like to see, especially to accelerate that funding into the upstream part, I would like to see more engagement from venture capitalists in the industry.
Yeah, good points, Jeff, and you hit the nail on the head. The chance of getting successful exploration as a junior, you've got to say, is probably less than 10%. So many of these companies probably won't fail as companies. They'll repurpose themselves, but on a project-by-project basis, they have the odds stacked against them. So they really are very similar in terms of risk profile to a startup.
So we've had a few comments come in, moving back towards the kind of the labor issue. And I think it all kind of comes down to communication and the messaging about the mining industry. Where do you think communication can come in a little bit more positive, or, to kind of address maybe things that people don't understand about the mining industry and what it can bring?
Well, I live in the island state of Western Australia. The messaging should come from the Premier. And while we've got closed borders, labour is going to be a huge problem. So it's not only a shortage of skills, it's the ability to, at the moment with COVID, to move people around the world to take up the positions that are available.
Yeah, I hear that.
I think you need a bit of a multi-pronged approach to that, to be honest, Amy. I think, you see a lot of kids at school coming out, and by the time they're teenagers, they have a very, sort of developed view of the world. But a lot of the times, it's not based in the facts of what's going on. What you're consuming, looking at, that's going to be one of the biggest things that can drive the push towards net zero is changing people's consumption patterns. A lot of people, blindly use, for example, cutlery without thinking that it's made of iron ore, coal, and nickel. They have no concept that that's real. 20 years ago, households had one TV. Now they've got 3 and 4 iPhones and 4 iPads and laptops and PCs, and we are consuming a lot more. Just making sure that people are aware of what they're consuming, and the fact that they're consuming these things, it comes from somewhere to start with, and just making sure that people are aware of that, I think, is the biggest thing. It probably starts with kids, but a lot of adults as well, right? And I think you need a public awareness campaign around just knowing where things come from. I think that's going to be the biggest, driver of behavior change.
I think that also plays into the idea of, the energy transition and decarbonization and the metals that are required for that, that are required to come out of the ground.
Exactly right. People don't realize, you need huge magnets in the middle of wind turbines. People have no concept that that's a requirement, or batteries for cars. It's just increasing people's level of general knowledge, I think, is going to be the biggest thing. Who does that? It's partly industry, it's partly government, it's partly forums like this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, Dan, and you're right. It's a multiplayer effort, really, because one of the statements that I made in a report that I wrote a couple of months ago is that nobody today questions the merit of agricultural products. There is no one in the Western world, at least, that doubts why it is useful to subsidize the farmers, because you don't want to be dependent on other countries for your food supply. And I think that same realization needs to come when it comes to critical minerals. You don't want to be dependent on other countries that you are not sure of will think in your best interest at the end of the day. So there needs to be a campaign. In my opinion, it needs to be a permanent campaign. When I grew up in the Netherlands, we were brought up with this idea that you had to drink milk and you had to eat eggs and some meat, and there was this whole campaign about this balanced food, the meal that you need to eat, and that it was healthy for you. Whereas in fact, it was also meant to stimulate the agriculture, right? So I think we need to do similar things with critical minerals. We need to show people, very tangible, that if we don't mine for these materials, you can forget about your iPhone. You can forget about the clean cars and clean energy.
I think we've got to take it one step further too, and I take Dan's point with respect to education as absolutely critical. We have to change our culture, we have to change our mindset, we have to be aware of what we're consuming, and we've got to get away from, absolutely have to get away from this attitude that everything is disposable. And we need to recycle many of these things to take a bit of pressure off the supply chain to start with, and to make sure that we have a lower carbon footprint. Now, those things sound pretty logical, but if you have a look at batteries in particular, and lithium-ion batteries in Australia, the recycle rate at the moment is about 3%. If you have a look at other countries, most companies that have stewardship schemes in place have recycle rates of something like 40, 45, 50%. And then if you have a look at places like Scandinavia and Switzerland, where they combine education programs with stewardship schemes. So the stewardship schemes are really just putting a levy on the product at the point of purchase and returning that to subsidise the recycling, and the consumer doesn't even notice it. So if you put together a combination of those things, the stewardship scheme plus the education, in places like Switzerland and Scandinavia, you've got recycling rates up in the high 70s and 80s. So education and changing the culture is absolutely critical. We aren't a single-use society.
Are you seeing recycling, I suppose, economically and technologically up to a point where it's actually helping the supply chains and the supply of these critical minerals?
Well, it's a growing industry in Australia, and it's in its infancy. And I've got to say, it's not performing well because of the collection rates of many of those materials. So we're still disposing of enormous quantities of that stuff to landfill. Australia is implementing a battery stewardship scheme in January of next year. And let me say, it's not a government scheme. This has been implemented by free enterprise. It's the companies that manufacture and import batteries that have done this, and there will be a levy charge come January. And one would hope when you commoditise those waste materials, it will stop much of it from going to landfill because it'll have a value. And in the case of batteries, and as batteries across the board, that value will be about $4,500 a tonne. If today you try and recycle just on the basis of recovering the metal value, you're a little bit better than break even. But if you can have that collection, separation, and recycling subsidised by a levy where everyone is contributing to the same cause, it should work.
So we're coming up to the close of the hour mark for this webinar, and I thought that we could maybe just close off with some thought, perhaps lessons learned from other government-led or other lending facilities, financing facilities. Have you seen any positive examples or any examples where perhaps they missed the mark? I know somebody started to mention NAPE and kind of efforts that have gone into financing there. Are there any examples, any takeaways that we can kind of move forward with Australia and other domestic supply chains?
I think if you look at it from a national point of view and compare Australia to other countries that are resource rich, such as Canada, but also some Scandinavian countries, and in particular Norway, I think Australia can obviously. I believe that Australian policymakers are watching what happens over the border. But what I personally like in the Canadian and Norwegian story is that they have the raw materials, but they also realize that they have clean and green energy, or the ability to provide energy from a clean and green source. And this is going to be a more important requirement as we continue this transition to clean energy. So in my view, Australia is in a very good position to play a role in this. As I mentioned, the country is blessed with raw materials, but on top of that has a lot of potential in clean energy supply to actually process it in a responsible way. And I think that will position the country very well to serve European markets in which the demand for clean products is increasing, and it will be the only way to source products. So I think, look closely to what the Norwegian colleagues and Canadian colleagues are doing. And I think Australia is in a very good position to replicate that, albeit not maybe with hydro, but with wind and solar.
And I think, just bringing back the critical minerals side of things as well, I think there's going to be some turbulence in the market over the next few years, particularly in terms of financing a lot of these projects. There'll be some good projects and some not so good as well, right? And that is also, part and parcel of mining, but it does have an impact on financing more generally. I think at the moment there is a realization from government that they really need to step in and make a difference here. And I think, the Export Finance Agency, very good example of that, that we have, that $2 billion facility available. And then state-based agencies as well, investment agencies are really trying to drive investment. A lot of that is coming from offshore. We're seeing a lot of US or Japanese or Korean investment coming into Australia. I think the Australian superannuation industry needs to step in here as well, because there are some phenomenal projects and there are some really good returns to be made if you're purely looking at it from an investment perspective. In the meantime, I think funds like us at Pure, where we sort of bridge the gap, if you like, I think we're lining up for a pretty big sort of next 5 or 6 years in this space particularly. But it is pleasing to see that government has realised that there's an industry that almost is in its infancy in terms of bringing that back to domestic shores and then restarting effectively the whole process again, just with a different set of minerals that we had 50 years ago. And
Jan, do you have any thoughts kind of regarding the future for these types of loan facilities, and any positive takeaways?
Yeah, look, I think it sort of just follows on from some of the earlier points made. I think on the assumption that there will be a few projects financed in the coming year or so, I think that'll instill a greater degree of confidence. I think that'll then probably raise the awareness amongst other investors and potential lenders to give them a degree of comfort that these kind of projects can be financed. And if we can achieve that kind of outcome, then I think we're well on our way to making some decent progress.
Great. And Adrian, I suppose to close things off, any final thoughts on kind of where you see things headed?
Oh, I think we've covered most of the critical issues, if you'll excuse the term. Supply chains need to be overhauled, there's no doubt about that, and financing becomes the second big issue. I think we've seen in the North American markets an appetite for special acquisition vehicles, SPACs, and they have made some investments into clean energy, and they've been very, very large investments indeed. So I think there is an alternative type of funding out there that's available at the moment. If you have a look at the 300 odd SPACs that are listed on the North American markets, there's only a handful that are dedicated towards clean technologies. But I think that's going to change, because there is an appetite for those sort of things, and that will remove some of the restrictions that certainly have been mentioned by Jeff, and that's the conundrum as to whether you have offtake first or financing first. One of those variables can be removed with fairly clever financial engineering. So I do see a pretty bright future from that point of view.
Sounds great. And that sounds like a good place for us to close off for today. So I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for the questions and the comments, and like to thank everyone on the panel for taking part and sharing your insights with us today. We should have potentially 1 or 2 more live webinars for the essay before the end of the year. And then we'll be starting up again mid-January with a full list of webinars, especially for the APAC region, as we remain online for the foreseeable future. So thanks everyone for taking part, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everyone.